September 26, 1983. The clock struck 0:15 Moscow time. Inside Serpukhov 15, the heart of the Soviet Union's early warning command center. The room was dim, but alive screens flickering, officers whispering in low tones, the steady hum of machines tracking the skies above the Atlantic. Then it happened. A shrill electronic tone tore through the silence. One screen went red, then another. Flashing Cyrillic read, "Launch detected. U.S. ICBM." For 3 seconds, no one moved. Then came the voice of the duty officer. Calm. Clipped. Practice satellite. Confirms one launch. Bearing Grand Forks, North Dakota. Likely Minuteman III. The second alert hit like a hammer. 4 more launches. Same bearing. Multiple re-entry vehicles probable. Inside the Soviet command chain. This was the moment the system was designed for. Phones came off receivers, protocol folders opened, codebooks were pulled. Within 60 seconds, the alert had reached Soviet General Staff. This was it, the beginning of the war they had trained for. The first strike, the decapitation scenario. Only one man didn't move. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, the ranking officer on duty that night, stared at the screen. He watched the pattern, the timing, the intervals. It didn't feel right. 5 missiles, not 500. The Americans wouldn't strike with so little. He glanced at the radar logs, no corroboration. Ground-based tracking was silent. But the satellite system was screaming. A decision had to be made. If he reported it as real, the next link in the chain would be activation of the nuclear response protocols, retaliatory launch orders, global war. If he called it a false alarm and he was wrong, he would have doomed the Soviet Union. He had 90 seconds to decide. Behind him, men watched with faces drained of blood. Around him, the system demanded obedience, but something didn't fit. The logic cracked. The pattern was too clean, too simple. He made the call. False alarm. No launch. It went quiet. No war came. No fire. No second wave. The world turned. What Petrov didn't know, what no one in the Soviet command knew in that moment, was that far above Earth, a satellite had caught the sun's reflection off high-altitude clouds and mistaken it for the heat plume of a U.S. missile launch, a glitch, a trick of the light. And for 90 seconds, it nearly triggered the end of civilization. To understand how the world came within seconds of nuclear war that night, you have to enter the mindset of the Soviet early warning apparatus, where assumptions weren't just beliefs, they were policy. The core assumption, America would strike first. Every Soviet defense model, every radar array, every strategic doctrine operated under the expectation that NATO, led by the U.S., would deliver a surprise nuclear attack. The only path to survival, Soviet planners believed, was immediate retaliation. Hesitation was death. This assumption led to another technology must replace time. With intercontinental ballistic missiles reaching Moscow in 20-25 minutes, the Soviet Union built systems not for deliberation, but for instant escalation. Satellites would detect launches, command would verify, missiles would fly, all within 15 minutes. In 1979, the USSR launched its crowning jewel of early detection, OCO, a network of orbital satellites designed to track American launches through infrared detection sensitive to the heat of rocket engines rising into the upper atmosphere. The assumption was simple. If OCO said it saw a missile, then there was a missile, because OCO couldn't be wrong. But no one considered what would happen if it ever was. At Serpukhov 15, the command center designed to process OCO's alerts. The layout reflected these assumptions, dozens of screens, but only a few operators. thick binders full of protocol, but no pages for ambiguity. Officers were trained to trust the system first, then confirm with radar. The system rarely triggered, but when it did, it demanded belief. Another dangerous assumption: U.S. nuclear doctrine matched Soviet thinking. Soviet command believed America would unleash an overwhelming first strike, hundreds of warheads, launched in waves. But they also feared a decapitation strategy, where only a few missiles would be used to destroy Soviet leadership, paralyze command, and delay response. That fear left a gap because it meant even a few missile detections had to be taken seriously. And that's exactly what the system showed. 5 launches, consistent trajectory, valid infrared data, no radar returns yet. The early warning officers were trapped. The protocols didn't allow for speculation. If the satellite said launch, they had to act. Except for one man, who dared to ask, why would the Americans start a war with 5 missiles? A question not found in any Soviet manual, because the manuals assumed the system was perfect, and that the enemy wouldn't hesitate, just like them. The Soviet nuclear doctrine of the 1980s was many things ruthless, efficient, layered, but above all, it was fragile. Not fragile in strength, but in logic. It rested on a razor's edge act instantly on warning or be annihilated. The concept was simple: launch on warning. If American missiles were detected inbound, the Soviets would not wait for impact. They would fire everything submarine-based, silo-based, mobile launchers within minutes. Every second lost meant fewer warheads launched before command centers were vaporized. This was not theory. It was doctrine, backed by hardened communications links, nuclear briefcases, and warhead-ready ICBMs scattered across the steppe, ready to fly on command. The entire system was calibrated to reward speed, not certainty. So when the OCO system sent its alert that night, the wheels of that doctrine began to turn instantly. Serpukhov 15 was the nerve center. Within 15 seconds of the first satellite detection, alert signals had reached the general staff, red folders were opened, keys retrieved, cipher sequences prepared. The next step would be activation of the Cheget, the Soviet nuclear briefcase, held by General Secretary Yuri Andropov. But there was a flaw. The doctrine relied on perfect automation, yet demanded human confirmation. A contradiction buried in the logic. The satellite saw something. The officer confirmed it. But if the officer hesitated, the delay could doom them. If he confirmed too fast, he could doom the world. And that officer was Stanislav Petrov. He sat at the decision point between data and annihilation. The screens in front of him showed 5 launches. The system demanded he validate. His training told him to trust the computer. But his instinct, honed from years of seeing drills, understanding trajectories, noticing what wasn't there, told him something was wrong. Where was the radar corroboration? Where was the logic in a 5-missile strike? No doctrine accounted for that question. The system was binary launch or not. But what if the reality was neither in that moment? The Soviet nuclear response plan, built over decades, tested in war games, feared by the world, came face to face with its greatest enemy, ambiguity. And ambiguity is the one thing the system was never built to survive. At exactly 15:23 Moscow time, the first warning icon flashed onto the main display at Serpukhov 15. An infrared sensor aboard the Soviet Cosmos satellite registered a heat bloom over Grand Forks, North Dakota, a signature that perfectly matched the launch profile of a Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile. Within seconds, the system assigned it a launch probability rating of 92%. 14 seconds later, another bloom, then another, then 2 more, 5 launches. The screen turned red. The computer declared missile attack underway. The room froze. This was the scenario every man in that control center had trained for, but never expected to see outside of a simulation. It was no longer theory. The machine had spoken, but something felt off. Stanislav Petrov, seated at the confirmation station, narrowed his eyes. The computer's confidence rating rose to 100%. The protocol in front of him was clear confirmed detection. Forward the report to General Staff. Wait for radar confirmation. Then initiate the final authentication ladder. And yet, Petrov hesitated. The Soviet system, unlike its American counterpart, relied heavily on single-channel verification. If the OCO satellite saw something, and the human operator confirmed, that was enough to unlock the next stage. But the radar arrays, the second source of truth, were still silent. Petrov knew the trajectory of a Minuteman III. He knew that 5 missiles from Grand Forks would not be aimed at random targets. They'd be aimed at Moscow, command nodes, launch silos. That many launches meant first strike. That meant radar returns should already be appearing. But they weren't. He stared at the time counter, 5 missiles, all supposedly in the air, and yet no speed change, no trajectory arc, no ground echoes. And that's when he remembered something from a technical manual buried in a footnote. Under rare solar conditions, high-altitude clouds could reflect sunlight directly into OCO's sensors, producing a signature almost identical to a missile launch. That footnote had been dismissed during training, but now, in the middle of the night, staring at 5 Phantom missiles, Petrov felt something shift. What if this wasn't war? What if this was sunlight? He made his decision. He picked up the phone and said, "False alarm. Technical malfunction. Do not proceed with alert escalation." The room held its breath. The clock kept ticking, and in the silence, the 5 missiles that never existed simply faded from the screen. Petrov had just overridden a billion-dollar machine. He had broken protocol and saved the world. The call to General Staff arrived at 0017, a full 2 minutes after the first detection. It wasn't the message Moscow expected. Missile attack alert dismissed. False alarm, satellite misread. Petrov's voice came through the encrypted line. The silence on the other end was long, then sharp. Repeat that. Lieutenant Colonel, 5 launches detected. Pattern inconsistent with full strike. No radar confirmation. Probable false positive due to solar reflection. No escalation required. The response was cold. That is not your decision to make, and it wasn't officially. Petrov's role was to report, not interpret, to confirm detection, not analyze strategic intent. The machine said launch. That was all Moscow needed. But Petrov had made the call anyway. Within minutes, a full internal review was initiated. Analysts at the General Staff pored over OCO's data. Multiple phones rang across bunkers. Officers reviewed ground radar logs, desperate for any trace of confirmation. There was none. Still, disbelief reigned. The idea that their prized early warning satellite system designed to detect the heat signatures of American missile launches from orbit could be fooled by sunlight was unthinkable. And worse, that a single officer, without authorization, had chosen not to forward the alert. One general demanded to know why the radar crews had not confirmed the launch. Another insisted the Americans might have developed new stealth capabilities, rendering radar obsolete. Someone else asked, what if this was a Test A probe to see if we'd hesitate? But slowly, the evidence piled up. No missile trail, no atmospheric re-entry signs, no changes in American strategic posture. The alert had been a ghost. Back at Serpukhov 15, Petrov sat silently at his console. He had disobeyed the most sacred principle in Soviet defense: trust the system. A superior officer called him in for questioning. "Why didn't you escalate?" he asked. Petrov answered, "Simply because 5 missiles are illogical. If they were attacking, it would be 500. There was no commendation, no praise. Just a nod and a file closed quietly, because Moscow couldn't admit what had happened. The doctrine had nearly triggered apocalypse over reflection. The machine had worked, but the logic had failed, and the only reason cities still stood was doubt. Not a protocol, not a satellite, but the gut feeling of one man. Even after the radar silence confirmed Petrov's suspicion, disbelief turned to justification, and then to paranoia. Some in the Soviet General Staff refused to believe the OCO system had failed. Instead, a more dangerous theory began to gain traction. The Americans had launched a decapitation strike. According to this scenario, the U.S. had fired a small salvo, not to destroy the entire Soviet Union, but to eliminate its leadership in a single, surgical blow. The concept wasn't new. Soviet planners had long feared a limited first strike aimed at severing command and control, crippling retaliation. And 5 missiles that could mean 5 targets: the Kremlin, General Staff HQ, nuclear launch centers, communications nodes, maybe even Andropov himself, to the men around the war table. It made a twisted kind of sense. Small enough to evade full detection, large enough to shatter command. The argument escalated. One colonel warned that inaction could be fatal. "If this is a decapitation strike," he said, "our silence guarantees our annihilation." Another officer demanded immediate transition to full readiness. But there was no fireball over the horizon, no secondary waves, no EMPs, nothing. Just 5 ghosts on a screen, and a theory that refused to die. Petrov's judgment, still holding the line, was now seen not as reasoned analysis, but dangerous restraint. He had broken the sacred chain of trust man confirming machine, and in doing so, he'd invited scrutiny. But his logic held. Why would a decapitation strike start with 5 missiles and not follow through? No one could answer. And still, the tension rose. Had this been a probe, a test of Soviet response? Was the U.S. baiting hesitation before a true first strike? This was the power of the wrong theory. It took incomplete data and replaced it with fear. It turned technological error into strategic conspiracy. The longer the Soviet high command debated, the more plausible the false narrative became. Even though nothing had launched, even though no target had been hit, even though the screen had gone dark, the missiles weren't real, but the panic was, because the system wasn't just built to detect war. It was built to believe in it. Just as the decapitation strike theory began to fade under the weight of silence and inaction, another emerged, one equally speculative and even more dangerous. Some Soviet analysts proposed that the Americans had launched missiles, but that they were using a new stealth technology, something that masked them from ground-based radar. In this theory, the OCO satellites had done their job. They had caught the launch, but Soviet ground systems radar nets in Belarus, Kaliningrad, and along the Arctic Circle had failed to see the incoming warheads. Why? Because the missiles had been cloaked. The implications were horrifying. If true, it meant that the entire Soviet detection architecture, based on triangulating satellite warnings with radar confirmation, was obsolete. The Americans could fire at any moment, and the USSR would never know until impact. The theory spread quickly. Some senior commanders even believed the West had developed plasma stealth coatings or suborbital glide delivery systems, technologies rumored but never confirmed. This was the second wrong theory. The system worked. But reality had changed. It was a seductive lie, because it preserved faith in the Oko satellite array. It preserved belief in Soviet technical superiority. It blamed radar gaps, not satellite failure. It turned a false alert into a sign of success. But it also pushed Soviet military leaders closer to the edge. If the enemy had developed stealth weapons that could evade radar, then the launch-on-warning doctrine would have to evolve. The timeline would have to tighten. The threshold for confirmation would have to shrink. Future alerts might require firing before full verification. Petrov's decision was quietly reevaluated. Some now argued that his refusal to escalate had been a lucky mistake that next time. The missiles could be real, and stealth would mask them until it was too late. The air thickened with paranoia, and the ghost missiles of that September night continued to haunt the halls of command, not because they were real, but because their absence demanded a new fiction. The Soviet response to a satellite error was not to fix the system. It was to fear the next ghost even more. And in doing so, they inched the world closer to real annihilation, because if 5 missiles could be stealthy, then next time, they might not hesitate. The Soviet Union prided itself on technological supremacy in its early warning architecture. From ground-based phased array radars to its space-based Oko satellite constellation, the system was designed to detect and respond to a U.S. nuclear launch with terrifying speed. But on September 26, 1983, that system failed not mechanically, but intellectually. The entire chain of strategic surveillance, from orbit to command bunker, was designed around certainty. The infrared sensors aboard the Oko satellite were calibrated to identify the heat signatures of American ICBMs moments after launch. The protocol was clear once the satellite detected a launch, and the on-duty officer confirmed the signal. An alert was sent to the Soviet General Staff, but the failure wasn't in the hardware. It was in the assumption that a heat signature could never lie. What no one in Soviet engineering had fully accounted for was a rare atmospheric phenomenon, high altitude, cloud formations illuminated at the perfect angle by the setting sun. From the satellite's orbital position, the light bouncing off the clouds mimicked the thermal bloom of a missile launch. The Oko system interpreted those reflections as hostile. That flaw had been raised once in a minor engineering memo written years prior, but it had been dismissed as operationally improbable. No drills had ever tested that edge case. No doctrine allowed for maybe. The machine didn't know it was wrong, and more importantly, the officers trained to trust that machine weren't trained to question it. When Petrov broke protocol and called it a false alarm, he exposed not just a glitch, but the brittle logic of the entire system. There was no fallback, no built-in skepticism, no multi-channel override. If Petrov had obeyed the alert, Moscow would have escalated into full nuclear readiness. Retaliatory orders could have followed. The most chilling realization in the post-incident review was this: the system had worked exactly as designed. And that was the problem. No one had programmed it to consider deception from nature. No one had trained officers to weigh human intuition against machine certainty. The intelligence apparatus had become a prisoner of its own confidence. American analysts later learned of the event through indirect channels. In their private memos, they quietly marveled at how close the Soviets had come. One CIA summary read, "Our adversary nearly launched on sunlight." Inside the USSR, a quiet panic gripped the upper ranks. There was no way to admit what had happened. The doctrine could not bend, so the incident was buried. But inside Soviet air defense, The truth was whispered. The system saw what it wanted. The people weren't allowed to disagree. And next time, the satellite might see something again, and there might not be a Petrov to stop it. While the Soviet early warning structure strained under its own rigidity, across the ocean, the United States had built a very different kind of shield, one defined not by speed alone, but by redundancy, verification, and doubt. American doctrine understood something the Soviets didn't want to accept, that machines make mistakes, that in a world of data, context matters more than speed. And so, the U.S. designed its nuclear warning network around layers, not linearity. Where the Soviet system relied heavily on infrared detection from the OCO satellite network, the American system combined multiple independent data sources, DSP satellites, geostationary satellites detecting missile launch heat signatures, ballistic missile early warning radars, BMEWs, high-powered ground stations, capable of tracking ICBMs mid-flight, pave-pause phased array radar systems that filled in regional gaps, submarine tracking naval assets positioned to detect launch signatures underwater, civilian-military integration FAA data streams used to verify airborne traffic anomalies. At the heart of this web was NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command, operating from Cheyenne Mountain. In stark contrast to the siloed Soviet model, NORAD was Joint Command, with both U.S. and Canadian officers analyzing incoming alerts in real time. And unlike in Serpukhov 15, where one man could accidentally start a chain reaction, NORAD required confirmation from at least two systems before an alert could be escalated to Stratcom or the President. Their doctrine accepted the unknown. A single satellite blip wouldn't lead to a launch alert. It would trigger a review. Analysts would cross-check heat data with radar returns. Human intelligence officers would weigh geopolitical tensions. Communications links to allies would be queried. That redundancy cost time, but it bought certainty. In 1979, when a training tape was accidentally loaded into NORAD's system and triggered a false, full-scale nuclear launch alert, protocols worked. Multiple checks delayed the alarm. Confirmation channels found the error. The U.S. didn't panic. It paused. Soviet systems didn't allow pauses. Their logic was shaped by the fear of being struck first and dying second. Their speed was a reaction to perceived Western treachery, but in doing so, they built a system that had no brakes. What saved the world in 1983 wasn't Soviet technology. It was Petrov's deviation from his training, something the American system didn't require, because it had checks built in. The true American advantage wasn't in missiles, satellites, or radars. It was in a doctrine that assumed ambiguity was normal, that a war might look like a test, that a missile might be sunlight, that machines might lie, and that humans must be allowed not just to obey, but to think. No cities burned, no missiles flew, no leaders died. But inside the Soviet command apparatus, the incident was treated like a war they had lost not to America, but to their own assumptions. In the hours that followed the false alarm, a quiet fury unfolded behind closed doors. The system had triggered as designed. The personnel had followed procedures, and yet the end of the world had nearly begun because a satellite mistook sunlight for fire. It was a strategic humiliation. OCO's designers were summoned, debriefed, pressed for answers. How could the satellite confuse atmospheric light with a missile launch? How could their billion-ruble network collapse over a cloud pattern? There were no good answers. Worse, there was Petrov. His report was clinical, accurate. He'd noted the anomaly, withheld escalation, and logged his judgment clearly, but Petrov had also disobeyed doctrine. His job was not to decide, His job was to pass information upward, to trust the system, not override it. This put Soviet command in an impossible position. If they punished him, they admitted the system had nearly killed the planet. If they praised him, they admitted that human intuition outperformed their military-industrial machine. So they chose the third option. Silence, no promotion, no commendation, just quiet reassignment. He disappeared from public records, not imprisoned, not honored, just erased. Behind the scenes, a review board convened to analyze what went wrong. Their conclusion was chilling. Operator response deviated from procedure. Satellite data uncorroborated. Potential risk of unauthorized non-escalation. In short, Petrov saved the world, and the system saw it as a flaw. Rather than fix the doctrine, the Soviets doubled down. Redundancies were added to OCO, yes, but the protocol was unchanged. The fear now wasn't false positives. It was hesitation. They feared the next Petrov might pause too long. Meanwhile, Western analysts remained unaware of how close they had come to catastrophe. No radar picked up Soviet missile mobilization. No alerts went public. The world slept through a crisis measured in minutes. But inside Soviet war rooms, generals now carried a new kind of terror. Not of American missiles, but of their own blind obedience. They had been ready to launch. They had come within one voice of retaliation. And that voice had dared to whisper no. That whisper humiliated them. Because it proved that the machines they worshipped, the logic they trusted, and the doctrine they built their empire upon could be wrong. And in the Cold War, being wrong was supposed to mean death. In the aftermath of the false alarm, there was no public fallout, no international scandal, no military standoff, but inside the Soviet Union's highest circles, something far more dangerous occurred, a quiet collapse of faith. For decades, the Soviet doctrine of deterrence had rested on three pillars: speed, certainty, control. The Petrov incident shattered all three. Speed. The system responded fast, but dangerously so. Had Petrov followed procedure, retaliation orders might have been transmitted before confirmation. That's speed, once a badge of strength, now looked like a loaded gun with a hair trigger. Certainty. The OCO satellite system, supposedly infallible, had been fooled by a natural phenomenon. Infrared signatures, long trusted as definitive proof of a missile launch, were now suspect. The very data that fueled the doctrine was no longer reliable. Control. The Soviet command structure had built layers of authority to ensure retaliation. But when those layers were tested, it was one man, one lieutenant colonel, who had more control than any Politburo member. Not because of his rank, but because of the decision he made when the machine demanded obedience. The implications were devastating. If the system could falsely escalate to the edge of nuclear war based on flawed data, what did that say about the entire Soviet strategy? The launch-on-warning model wasn't just brittle, it was insane without perfect information. And perfection was now proven to be an illusion. The most elite minds of the Soviet military, who had built and maintained these systems, suddenly found themselves standing on intellectual sand. Everything they designed, trained for, and enforced had nearly produced the opposite of peace. And yet, none of this could be said aloud. Official reports minimized the event. Petrov's name was omitted from documents. No formal changes were made to protocol. The entire incident was classified under system test. But the rot had begun. Privately, senior officers expressed doubts. Some began to push for changes, more human oversight, better satellite filtering, revised engagement thresholds. They were overruled. The Soviet Union was not a system that tolerated contradiction, and the Petrov incident was the ultimate contradiction proof that the enemy wasn't America. The enemy was certainty itself, and so they buried it. They buried the moment their empire stood on the brink, not because of malice or provocation, but because it couldn't tell the difference between war and a cloud. For decades, the world never knew. The Red Alert of September 26, 1983 never made the news. No press conference, no leaked documents, just a footnote in a closed Soviet file, buried under the heading System Anomaly. And Stanislav Petrov, whose quiet decision saved hundreds of millions of lives, returned to civilian life in near-total obscurity. No medals, no parades, just the weight of a night he never forgot. Only years later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, did the truth emerge. And when it did, the world learned how close it had come to annihilation, not by enemy action, but by a misread signal, and a man who chose to pause when the system told him to act. Petrov's story isn't just a Cold War footnote. It's a warning that the most dangerous threat in a nuclear age is not always a missile. Sometimes it's certainty, the kind that tells you machines don't make mistakes, the kind that rewards obedience over thought, the kind that builds weapons faster than it builds judgment. The Cold War was full of moments like this, hidden, forgotten, dangerously unresolved. And that's why we tell these stories. If this episode made you rethink what you thought you knew about Cold War history, consider subscribing. Every week, we reveal how close the world really came to fire, to failure, to full-scale war. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. Stay sharp, stay skeptical, stay informed, because history doesn't repeat itself, but in the wrong hands. It only takes one mistake.